Ratzon. Okay. We want to pursue the discussions that we have been having in these sessions. As we pointed out, the first stage, the first step to human thought, to something that basically is called human, is Seichel Anushi, human Seichel. It sounds almost like a simple statement, and everybody should be clearly aware of it, but it's not necessarily so, because we very often misunderstand what Seichel is. And as a matter of fact, the world today is completely oblivious to this, because they don't see the difference between a human being and a havlan animal. So we could see that this is something which can slip out, which is not so to a human mind. If he doesn't really pay attention to it, he will not be aware of it. And this is the first step. This is a prerequisite for further development. Like we said, Derech Eretz, the Mishnah says, Kodmo l'Torah. Derech Eretz precedes Torah. You know what Derech Eretz is? The ways of the world now, with common courtesy, common sense. Kodmo l'Torah precedes Torah. Why does it precede Torah? Because in order to understand the first thing about Torah, you first have to understand that there is such a thing as Derech Eretz, which means something defined by the human mind, rather than defined by the physical entity, by the physical world. That is true only because a human being recognizes that it's true. Otherwise, there's no way to force it, no way to prove it. So this we went over many times, and we finally started talking on a higher level, which is essentially what is called Seichel Eliki, godly perception. What is Seichel Eliki? Elokus, godliness, as we learn and we all understand, although we understand, we know the truth of it, but we don't necessarily really comprehend and relate to it. That's a whole avoid in itself. But we know that it's true, that Elokus is everything. And then the question is, if it's really everything, why is it so difficult to identify it and to see it? Why is it so elusive? Everybody knows what the word elusive means? It eludes you. You miss it. Like you pass by and it's there and it's screaming you in the face and you miss it. Why is it so elusive? If it's all everything and nothing functions without Elokus. So to start understanding this union, I want to first lay down, so to speak, certain points. We have to know that just as the physical object is much more obvious than the mental perception, like we have a lot of difficulty relating to the concept of Seichel Anushi, of human Seichel. And yet, a physical object we can readily identify, which shows that the more spiritual something is, the more difficult it is to identify it. The more physical, and we'll discuss why this is so and so forth over the time. But this we see as a fact, that the physical we can readily identify. Something a little bit more spiritual, a little bit less weighty, and less physically defined, becomes a little more difficult to identify. For instance, we all know that this is a recorder. The reason we know it's a recorder is because we have inquired and we found out that this is a recorder. But if we never saw this object, we never saw a recorder, and we see this article, this object, would we doubt that this is a physical object? Would we doubt that this has metal in it? That we can readily see. But what its function is, that we already have to find out. And even after we find out, and someone tells me, this is a recorder, we'll be very curious and see, how does it record? How does it work? So this is still on a physical level, because a recorder works entirely physically explainable. There's nothing mysterious about it. And yet, because the physical object itself, you can measure it and you can weigh it. So therefore, it's undeniably there, and I don't need to be introduced to it. Nobody has to tell me it's there. But what its function is and how it works, this is something which does not have weight and does not have measure. It's just its design and its mechanism. And for that, you need special introduction, special explanations. In similar fashion, we see, for instance, a human being. We see his structure, his feet, his hands, his body, his head, but we don't see his brain, his seichel. In order to identify his seichel, that he thinks, that we have to prove to ourselves, yes, he thinks. And even the person to himself also needs special conviction that his thoughts are viable, are important. Quite often, people doubt themselves. People come from a direction where they say, okay, if I can put it down on the table, I can define it in dollars and cents, in weight and measure, then I have done something concrete. But if I think and I learn and I understand, that's what is its true value? What is it? And you can almost ignore it and say, what's the difference? My father, Abba Paltiel, told me this incident from the time that he was a child. It's like the turn of the previous century. So he said that in their town, there was a Yid who made a lot of money. Whatever, he wasn't a big merchant. In those days, they used to deal with forest, with wood. If you subcontract a forest from the local count, and you can harvest the wood, and you would send it down the river, and many people made nice livings from that. And he was successful, and he was a successful businessman. But he was totally illiterate. He couldn't write his name. So he came to the bank and he deposited his money. And his signature on his checks was a sign, some kind of like an X or whatever it is, a symbol. So some people approach him and says, hey, Rabbi Yankiv, whatever his name was, it doesn't fit. You, such a big, successful man, should not sign your name. It's signed by a symbol. So he says, if you sign your name perfectly, literally, nobody's going to give you money. If I put a symbol on, they'll give you money. So coming down to it, the question is not whether, what the value of the literacy. You can ignore it. Literacy has its purpose. The purpose is that you should be able to sign a check. But if I can't sign a check and I had the money, it's the same thing.
I don't understand.
Don't understand?
No, I mean the guy like signed the check and he said like my ex is like worth more than your signature because I have the money in the bank. Do you not?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so do you understand?
You don't understand.
Okay.
Okay. The point is that we all readily understand, even though we don't really pay attention to it necessarily, and I'm calling your attention to it, that the more spiritual something is, the more elusive it is. Elusive means you can ignore it more easily. Where on the other hand, really, it is much more important than the physical. And we know it from experience. That we know that if someone has a physical pain, even if it is an acute pain, as for shalom, he breaks a limb, something, of a serious matter, and it hurts him. He can tolerate it. He can put on a cast and go through the period of healing and come out an unbruised person, so to speak, a healthy person. But if someone has what's called emotional pain or intellectual pain, someone feels, God forbid, emptiness in his life, that pain, you don't see it on the surface, but it's much more acute. A person can, acute, more sharp. He can't find a place for himself. It's not just pain, it's something that completely negates. Negates means nullifies his whole person. He can't do anything. Nothing means anything. The more spiritual something, the more elusive it is, but really it is infinitely more significant. And the same is absolutely true. If you follow through this, as I said, I'm just putting down the groundwork. The physical world is the most obvious, the least significant. The higher you go in the spiritual sense, the more elusive it is, the more significant it becomes. The most significant presence is God, is godliness, and it is also the most elusive. You can go through life, God forbid, completely ignorant of it, not know the difference. Ignore it completely. And just go through it. Eat, sleep, play baseball, whatever it is. Not ever ask yourself, what it's about. Doesn't bother you. The physical world forces itself on you. You can't ignore it. The spiritual world does not force itself on you. The spiritual world is that which you, as a human being, with your soul, with your intellect, identify and recognize. And the super spiritual world, which is godliness, is entirely elusive, does not force itself on you at all. It is something that, what's called, coming from, not even from your intellect, it comes from your soul. And you can be completely ignorant of it. I said I'm just laying down the groundwork, and as much as we can accomplish in this session, in next session, I want to elaborate on this. It is pointed out in the way God created the world, a very significant phenomenon. A person, for survival, needs basically 4 things. He needs food, he needs drink, water. He needs air to breathe. He needs shelter.
Sleep, no?
Shelter. Huh?
Sleep also.
I'm sorry?
Sleep, because like a person talks about
Sleep?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there are many things that he has to do. I'm saying what are the things that he needs from outside? He needs food to give him sustenance. He needs water. He needs air. He needs shelter. Shelter includes garments and so forth. Okay. Perhaps we can separate garments and shelter. And God has designed it so that the more imminent the requirement is, the more readily available it is. Air, a person cannot survive without air more than a minute. I know you were 3 minutes under the water. How long were you underwater? About a minute. Oh, well, Hashem, so be heavy here. So be heavier here? Air is of all the things that a person requires from external sources. I mean, he has an neshama in himself and so forth. And from the world is air. It is a constant requirement, literally constant. And air is readily available without any effort. To the extent that we inhale, we partake of air, if everything is okay, the air is fresh and we can breathe normally, there's no obstruction or anything, we're not even aware that we're breathing. We're not even aware that there is such thing, that there's a need of air. It's just we're taking it for granted completely. It just happens automatically. We're not even pursuing, we're not concerned about it. The next most important requirement is water. Water is not as readily available as air. But still, water is available in truth wherever you go. Naturally. As a matter of fact, if you dig deep down in the ground, almost any place, you're bound to hit water. Fresh water. Food is the next most important thing. And that one is clearly aware of how am I going to obtain food. Food has to be produced. And it has to be obtained. It comes in certain times of the year. It's not something that you can turn around and say, okay, just stretch my hand out, dig into the ground and get food. The next thing is garments, which requires even a greater effort. And the last thing is shelter, a house, which is the least imminent, the least important, so to speak, for human survival. Although clearly one cannot live normal life without a house, but in terms of survival, that's the first thing. And that's why it is the most difficult to obtain, the most difficult to acquire. In the context that we were discussing, in our discussion, we would put it the following way. When one has a house, he is very strongly aware of the fact that he has a house. He doesn't take it for granted. When one has a garment, he's also aware, but not as much as of a house. One has food, then he is less aware than of garments. Water is even less aware. And air is almost totally unaware. Although air is literally the breath of life. The most important thing. It defines life. As a matter of fact, the word neshama, we all know neshama comes from the word neshima, which means breathing. Sometime in Mitzvah Shem we'll have a chance to discuss this. What's the relationship between neshama and neshima? Why is breathing mean so? But that's what it comes from, because breathing is the primary source of life, the primary sign of life. Coming back to the topic, to the real topic at hand. As we mentioned before, godliness is the least imposing presence. Then spiritual thought and so forth is more imposing than godliness, and down the line until we come to the physical, which is totally imposing. What's behind that? Just as in the illustration of the 5 levels of human need, air is the most imminent requirement, and what we are hardly aware of it. Godliness is the most imminent requirement, as we will discuss, and we don't have to be aware of it. The physical presence is the least significant, and this is what we are most aware of. Let us try and understand this. What do we mean by saying that godliness is the most important, the most required thing? Clearly, if speaking from a philosophical point of view, in terms of the truth and so forth, where the world comes from and all that, that's not what we're engaged in. Clearly, God has to create a world. If God didn't create a world, there would be no world. But we are talking about from our perspective, from our experience. What does the present and the meaning of the word God, godliness, mean to us? This is what we are examining. Let us project from our own experience the following scenario, the following situation. We have this person has wealth, he has a house, empirically furnished, richly furnished, appointed perfectly, everything, having absolutely everything in it. Okay, I want to step back a little bit because I don't want you to miss this. Step back a bit. I'm explaining the concept. We're saying godliness in our perception, not just on a philosophical level, is the most imminent, the most important thing, and yet the most elusive. We're not aware of it. And I'm giving the following analogy. One has a house perfectly well appointed. In other words, he has all the furnishings, well-built house, with all the proper trimmings and windows, at best as one can imagine. And we will make it very simple. This perfectly appointed house is located in the middle of the Sahara Desert. You know what the Sahara Desert is?
A desert.
Yeah, Sahara Desert down south. Okay? Or someplace in the frozen hills of Alaska. Okay? We know, for instance, that an apartment in Crown Heights, a small apartment, a big apartment, to get a housing in Crown Heights, an apartment you can pay $900, you can pay $1,500, you can pay $2,500 for an apartment, just for rent. Okay. You go down to Manhattan, you pay this money for a little cubicle. What's the difference? And if you go down to the Sahara, you can get this big palace for the same money, for less. I'm sorry?
To rent it, you probably can do it for free.
I'm sorry?
To build it, that's a problem. But if it's built already, you can rent it for free, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. You can have it. It's yours for the having.
The difference in demand.
Why is the difference in demand? Why is there a greater demand? This tells us, it brings us face to face with the following phenomenon, and it's important that we recognize it. The house and all that's in it represents the physical objects. Each thing in the house can be identified by name. It has an X number of windows. It has the ceilings are X feet high, and the rooms are 30 by 20. Whatever it is, everything is measurable. And these are things which you can readily identify. And yet, its location, which has nothing to do with the house. As I said, you can have that identical house in the Sahara. Nothing to do with the house at all. Its location transforms the house from a valuable entity to a totally insignificant edifice. Totally insignificant. I'm sorry?
You can't say insignificant and edifice in the same, you understand? Edifice means...
It is an edifice though, right? It's a structure.
Insignificant, okay.
Totally insignificant. We have to examine this and understand. How do we understand? I mean, these are all things so obvious, but we don't pay attention to it, to understand its significance. This brings us face to face with a concept that, yes, I can do and work and accomplish, but if it's done in a vacuum, it is insignificant. It's meaningless. It's in the Sahara. I was kind of gracious and said Sahara. I could have said, which is true, I could have said in the Mars. On the moon. It's totally insignificant. It's meaningless. So we can recognize readily that the fact that something occupies us, that something challenges us, that we seem to be accomplishing and building, is not in itself meaningful. We fail to recognize that we are actually relating it to something much greater without being aware of it, just as we are not aware of the air that we breathe. There are people, as a matter of fact, someone showed me a video of people who chose voluntarily to live in Alaska. But I'm not talking in the towns, in the cities of Alaska. I'm talking about deep down in the frozen oceans of Alaska. Total isolation. And certain episodes kind of remained in my mind from this video. This guy is flying his little plane. Don't forget, he's living in Alaska, but he's got a plane, he's got, he's still in contact a little bit. He's flying this little plane, and he says, on this recording, he says, what an experience. What a wonderful feeling. You fly for miles and miles and miles. You don't see a single human being. What an experience. They only see frozen hills and whatever it is. You see bears. Yeah, what an experience. That type of experience, we have to understand, is self-imposed. It's an imaginary experience. As a matter of fact, he survived over there, I think, a couple of years, and then he moved back to be amongst human beings. Because whatever you accomplish, it's insignificant. There is nothing to it. You're living literally a physical life, just like the bear and the what are birds are over there?
Penguins.
And penguins. Literally, there's no human context to it.
You're saying accomplishments are only significant when other people can see them?
No. I want to. Well, there is something to it, but there is a background to that also.
Because if it's meaningful for the person, I mean, accomplishments are for the individual person, so if it's meaningful for him personally and only for him, then what's the difference of the Sahara?
Okay, so that's exactly what I'm trying to lead on to. First, I want that we should project and relate to this. And then we will see where real significance comes from. You're right that people feel accomplishment when they are amongst other human beings. But there is a further background to that. Why being with other human beings is significant.
No, he said, no, it's exactly. He said that if an experience makes sense to the person, that's all that counts. He doesn't have to do
Okay.
some.
This is exactly what I'm trying to point out. That if we project that concept and project this accomplishment in the Sahara or in the Alaskan desert, Alaskan mountains, we will readily see that that's not what's significant about it. Personally, the reason that we think we tend to relate to our accomplishments like individually, we're not even interested in somebody else's seeing it. That's only a facade. That's because we're not aware, because we are living in a civilized world. And therefore we're taking it for granted, we're not aware of all other influences that come into our minds. But if we take that away and we project to that emptiness, we will readily see that I don't see any meaning to it. Why should I? And there's nothing to it. There was a tragic incident in the Russian space program. The Russians were anxious to catch up and surpass the Americans. This is going back during the competition. And in their wisdom, they shot up some astronauts into space, and they were unable to bring them back. And these astronauts accomplished, they flew up into space. Is that an accomplishment? Oh, I'm flying in space. Wow, what an experience. What an accomplishment. It was a tragedy. They kept it secret. But we know about it because we intercepted the radio and messages. how do we understand all of this? Yes, to have food is important. To have water is important. To have clothing is important. To have housing is important. But all of that has to have a context. The context means it has to be some place, in a place that the place itself has significance. If it is in emptiness, then everything automatically loses its value and its significance. And this will now bring us to the point that we're trying to discuss. There's a big world. There's a physical world, a world of physical objects, houses, cars, computers, baseballs, whatever it is. Or what do you call these special running shoes, whatever it is? Huh? Oh, sneakers, come on. What are the special? Huh?
Air Jordans.
Oh, something, whatever it is, sneakers with a name, with a label, with a brand that you put. My brother is in Australia, very sharp guy. So he was here, and his wife took him to buy a hat. In Australia, they don't have the hats that we have over here. And he bought, of course, a Borsalino. So he was sitting over there, and he was going to bench, whatever it is. So so I think his wife or somebody says, "Oh, where is your hat?" He says, "I don't have a hat. I have a Borsalino."
Like, what's the, like...
What's the message?
Yeah.
The message is that we have a lot of things and we attribute a lot of value to their nuance, to their design, to their very specifics, not just what it does for us physically, but what it represents. Oh, I'm wearing a Borsalino, blah, 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 I'm particular about what I wear, all of these grandeur. Who knows, the grandeur. What? Okay. All of that, and a person can experience and build a whole life in this world. And like we said before, he can build a house and what's called appointing it, with perfect appointment, with perfect design and so forth. But he misses one point. He misses to be aware, although it is really there, because otherwise he couldn't lift a hand to do anything. That the real significance of all of that is the context. And I want to come to the climax. There's a physical world, and there are physical objects. Then on top of that, there are quote-unquote spiritual things. Spiritual things in this context does not necessarily mean inspiration or insight. Let's say somebody is an engineer, he knows how to do things. Or somebody is a wrestler, he knows he has certain skills. This is more on the skill level, which you have to learn, which you have to practice. All of these things are there, and this is part of our life and part of our experience. Part of what occupies our minds, makes life easier, interesting. Right? This is what we do. Then on top of that, higher than that, perhaps we go and learn. In the secular world, this is called learn humanities, literature, art. Lahavdil, in the Torah world, we learn Torah. And even deeper and higher, we learn Chassidus. All of that is part of our experience. We enjoy learning Gemara, we enjoy learning Chassidus. We enjoy interacting with our friends. We enjoy sitting together and singing a song and saying L'chaim. This is going up higher and higher. Take God away of that, out of this, which means take, where is this all happening? All of this is happening in emptiness. There is no reason the world should be. There's no purpose. It's just the experience that you're involved in. It's not a real thing. Then the whole thing collapses. It implodes. It loses everything. Where is this all happening? We are aware of, as I said, of all kinds of things being in the world. And we are asking the question, where does this come from? What is this for, and what is this for, and how is this made, and so forth. But one question that we don't even ask, because this is like breathing air. Where does existence come in? What does it mean to exist? We are talking about what exists, but what is existence? That we take for granted. If we would imagine that this is not a real entity, it's your imagination. This is in your imagination. It exists in your imagination. There's nothing real about it. Without the presence, without recognizing, without godliness, the whole world is an imaginary world. I'm imagining that I have friends. I'm imagining that I'm working. I'm imagining that I'm successful. Because there's no reality to existence. There's no reason for existence. There's no source for it. No basis for it. This is infinitely more profoundly painful than saying I'm living in a desert, in this beautiful palace in the Sahara. Because this is totally devoid of any significance, of any value. And where do I turn? There's nothing there, nowhere to turn. This explains two most profound points. On the one hand, godliness and our sense of recognition of the presence of godliness is like breathing air, and above much more, infinitely more significant, because this is what gives everything significance. On the other hand, this is the one thing that we can be completely oblivious to. Because there's nothing, because what we are aware of are objects. Either objects or concepts or experiences. We don't experience godliness. This is the background. This is just there. So that, what is the meaning of, we always say, Breishis, Bora, Lekim, Hashemayim V'Haaretz. God created, this is the beginning. Breishis. What is the very beginning of human thought? What starts human thought? Like the Rambam states it. Where does my curiosity begin? Why do I want to know anything? It's because I know one principle, that if there is anything, it's a godly creation. Therefore, whatever I investigate, whatever I touch, what am I investigating? What did God create? There is a basis for it. There is a context. It has a meaning and a value. And who am I? I'm part of that meaning and that value. The Breishis, the beginning of human thought, is Bora Elikim T'Shamayim V'Haaretz. This is what set everything in motion. This is what gives. This is, like we said, this is the breath of life. We take it completely for granted, just as, on a much lower level, we take for granted that having a big house is a good thing. But we don't realize that it's not the house, it's the location that makes it good. Because take the same house in a different location, it's valueless. Not only valueless in terms of money, dollars and cents, it's valueless, I can't live there. It's not a human habitat. It's not made for human beings. It's for penguins. This permeates, and what permeates means is it drills through and through every human thought and every human action. But we are, practically speaking, we are unaware of it. Just like air, we are unaware that we are breathing air. Until, chas v'sholom, God forbid, we have heart, we can't breathe, chas v'sholom, we can't catch our breath. Then we become acutely aware. Then that's the most painful thing. Physically speaking, that's the most painful thing, when a person is gasping for air. To be unaware of godliness, God forbid. And I said, everyone is aware of it. Constantly. God forbid we should be unaware of it. It's pain more acute than gasping for air. Because everything collapses. There is nothing there. This insight is such that can keep a person afloat. Afloat, what afloat means? Carry him through every challenge, every obstacle. This is how the Chassidim in the generation before ours survived under all the circumstances that they survived. Because if you can't survive without air, you can survive without godliness. This is on the negative side. And on the positive side, this is the most powerful. One reflects on it, and even without reflection, we have to understand this is the source of inspiration, the source of strength for absolutely every moment of our day. As you pointed out many times, Moed Ani Lefonechu is how we begin the day. Why? Because in order for me to wake up, I have to know that it's going to return my soul to me. It's not just a physical phenomenon. Because a physical phenomenon without a context, without a background, without a meaning, doesn't do anything for me. Even when one, as we said, in imagination, he tells himself that he's accomplishing and he's doing and so forth, in the back, deep down in his mind, he says, but it has meaning, it has value. Because if he were convinced that it had no value, it's just my own experience, he would lose everything. Completely. We are entering, so to speak, the arena, that area where we can begin to discuss and to think on the Torah level, what's called the godly soul, godly concepts. Like we said, Seichel Eliki. Seichel Eliki, which is inherent in each one of us. Seichel Eliki dictates that not only should my actions be good and productive, but my actions must have a basic significance, must have a godly value. Otherwise, they have no value. And I'm looking to recognize that value. This is the beginning, this is the meaning of Seichel Eliki. This is something which has no weight, something that has no measure, something that cannot be measured in terms of any worldly quantity. And yet, this is the basis of all existence. This is like the space where the house is built. Which gives the house all of its meaning. Not just some of it, everything. So Hashem should help, should give each one of us a clear view of a clear view of the purity of our lives, purity of Torah, purity of Yiddishkeit, what our lives are based on, what we really seek. Give us the full strength to carry through in the face of all worldly challenges. And ultimately, we are the ones who will purify the world. The world will get to agree with us rather than Chas v'Sholom, us agreeing with them. Because that's our function. We will reveal in the world its true meaning, rather than Chas v'Sholom, them swallowing. There's no way. That has been proven over the last 3,500 years. We survive, and everything else falls down. Right? We carried through the years of exile, 2,000 years now and before, and so on, throughout the ages. Do you know that during the second Beis Hamikdash, the whole period in the second Beis Hamikdash, even though we had our land, we were not Israel, we had the Beis Hamikdash, we weren't our own rulers. We were subject to other rulers, except for a short period after Hanukkah. We were subject to other rulers. We were not independent. And there were all kinds of decrees, all kinds of rules imposed upon us. We survived them all. There is not a trace of any of those emperors and those empires. Why? How did we survive? Because we related to the air, we related to the truth. And that carried us through, because that's indestructible. There was a great hurricane. In this year, there were all kinds of natural disasters. There was a great hurricane. I don't remember exactly which town it was mentioned. Almost 3/4 of the town was wiped out.
This year?
This year.
Punta Gorda.
What was it?
Punta Gorda.
Punta Gorda. Okay. Wiped out. What do you think is going to happen there? The whole thing is going to be rebuilt. Guaranteed. Why? Because the place is significant. Not the houses. The houses were wiped out, but the place wasn't. And it's going to be rebuilt. Our strength lies not in our houses, quote unquote. I mean, not in all our abilities. It lies in the fact that we relate directly to the true essence. That's indestructible. And this is what carries us through. This is what brings us here. This is what allows us to succeed with Nebuchadnezzar's Hill, to learn one more, one less, and to build, in Mitzvah Shem, Jewish families and go to Mashiach. This is it.
I thought there was no penguins in Alaska.
I think